All right, everyone. Good afternoon. This is still the Drisha Summer Kollel 2024. This is Together, the Tribes of Israel, Core Themes of Sefer Bamidbar, and it's our second session with Rabbi Jon Kelsen. Sources for today's class will be posted in chat once Rabbi Kelsen gets underway. And with that, I want to hand things over to him.
All right. Thank you, Kayla. Hi, everybody. So let's just remind ourselves what we did last week. We're in the second of a three-part series on core themes of Sefer Bamidbar, and as I mentioned, this is really it's akin to an introduction or a prologue to the book, trying to give an overall picture or schematic, make an argument about what the book is about, but that can't replace, obviously, more in-depth learning. And for that, I invite you to always return to us, but also return to the book itself. Did anybody get a chance over the week to read more of the text itself? Okay, so you did, you guys, a little bit. Okay, so as you gain more and more familiarity with the book, I encourage you to, in this context, and then also with Rabbi Silber next week, who'll do the last part of this series, to speak up and share ideas. I'm less interested in sort of lecturing here, and more interested in having a conversation about the book. Okay. Okay. So first off, what from last week, if you recall, if you don't recall, I'll give you a second to think. What from last week's learning, hey Willa, what from last week's learning or beginning of exploration of this book has stayed with you? Was withheld the test of 7 days time. Yeah, Miranda.
I was left thinking about how you mentioned that Leviticus and Numbers are maybe not linear, and maybe they kind of branch off from Exodus, and the end of Exodus sort of lining up with the beginning of both Leviticus and Numbers. And when I went through and started reading Numbers, I just felt that was very resonant and interesting.
Interesting. And so first of all, I'm just writing in the chat, that was an insight from Rabbi Yoel ben Nun, just to give credit where credit is due, who is sort of a cutting edge Tanakh thinker, reader in Israel. And Miranda, you have to respond now. I'm curious if anything within that framing, did any other pieces of Numbers jump out as oh, that's picking off of Exodus as opposed to Leviticus?
I'm not sure yet, but in my general Torah study and learning from certain people, I have heard different theories about how things are not chronological in the Torah, and various examples of that. So
right.
I'm interested to see where else that comes up.
Terrific. And that comes up in the book of Bamidbar, by the way, because the book starts with the first verse. It's actually on your source sheet, which I'm not going to screen share right now, but if you want to have it open in tandem here, right? I think the first source I cited there was the beginning of the book, right? 1:1, and that takes place when, right? It's in the wilderness of Sinai, in the tabernacle or the tent of meeting, on the first of the month of the second year of leaving Egypt. But later in the book, there are references to things that happened in the first year of leaving Egypt. So even the book itself is not numbered that way. And in case you're this is not a study of this topic, but of this concept, there is this concept of what you're referencing, right? Ein mukdam u'meuchar b'Torah. It's a phrase we find in the rabbis, in Chazal, that there's no earlier and later in the Torah, literally, meaning that the Torah is not written in chronological order. There's a debate among the commentaries as to whether or not that sort of rule of thumb or that assumption is held by. Famously, Nachmanides argues that it is written in order, and Rashi argues, and others argue not. But I just want to say that those who argue that it's not in chronological order, it doesn't mean that it's ordered randomly, right, or arbitrarily. What they mean is that the ordering is not governed by chronology, and therefore it's governed by some thematics or something else, right? It's governed by the content, right? So it makes you, if you think it's organized chronologically, so then you are then the reason for any ordering is simply what, how it happened, chronology. But the interpreter has to be sort of more work harder, right? Or has to be sort of more alert, more on their toes if you think that it's not ordered chronologically, because that means the order is thematic or interprets something else, and then you have to sort of ask yourself, so what is that ordering about? It's not just about like how it happened to happen. Anyway, terrific. Thank you. Lola, anything that stuck with you from last week?
I think we talked about like the duality between like there's this contrast of all this like order, like you're encamped and everyone knows exactly where they are, and then also like that it's kind of this mystical supernatural world that can be very chaotic and there's a lot of rebellion.
Right. So you're referencing we saw actually two in our introduction. We saw two introductions, right? One by Nachmanides and one by the Netziv, or Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin. And in the second, the Netziv, I think what you're mentioning is that he argues that you can divide the book into two, indeed, right? And the book is actually about the transition from the generation that left Egypt to the generation that enters the land, that will eventually enter the land. And just to clarify something, what he argues is that it's the former, right? It's in the ordered world, right? Mystical, as you call it, supernatural world. That's the world of those who left Egypt, because they're the ones who are supported entirely by God, right? These are redeemed slaves, right, if you will, who who are not, I guess, raised in autonomy, right? They're not really able to function that way, and they don't function that way, right? They're fed from heaven, as one, example. So their battles are fought by God, etc., or at least that's the picture. It's in that world that everything is sort of seems, ordered around the camp, or the camp is ordered around the tabernacle, and it's things get more, natural, as the Netziv would put it, and also, I would say unruly and such, when you start to shift, as you gradually shift towards the generation that will enter the land. Okay, right, terrific. So yeah, that inside of the Netziv is very important, because it's a way of thinking about the whole structure of the book, or the whole, the pivot of the book is really built around, according to the Netziv, built around that transition from one generation to another. And we talked about that as also a transition from, sort of order into disorder or something along those lines. Awesome. Yasmin, what anything you were left with?
I'm still thinking about the cloud and how we think about clouds now, in terms of technology and how they use the cloud to navigate. And it was basically, someone mentioned that the late Jonathan Sachs was talking about GPS when we live our own lives, and how sometimes when we mess up, we're recalculating. I thought that was nice.
That is interesting. Right. That's true. The metaphor of the cloud. That's a good one. Willow, anything from last week's learning that stuck with you, or that you're still thinking about?
Definitely thinking of like the emotional dynamics of going from like having everything be ordered into like disorder, and just like a generation growing up like with a divine cloud, and then one day like it's just not there. That's that's a lot.
Right. So what's that story about? You see how you can read it. I'm not claiming this is like the meaning of the text in some sort of authorial intent level, but you can see you can read it as a story of coming of age.
Right.
Some sort of
it's very like foundational in that way. It's like my mom used to say like, oh well, there's only one store and it's the oldest one in the world. It feels like that kind of.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. By the way, this tale, or this trope, or this dynamic of shifting from a world of order and alongside with like being cared for, and then to a world of more of some sort of rupture, and then and more independence, right? Might ring a bell from earlier in this book called the Torah, called the Chumash, right? Which is, I'm thinking of the Garden of Eden, right? You have Genesis 1, right, which is, you have a similar sort of feel, I think, to the beginning of Bamidbar, right? The sense of repetition and order, repetition in the syntax, right, in the language, order, patterns, separation. Everything is structured. Everything has its place, right? And it's in that world where the humans created and put into this garden, and the garden provides everything except for that one tree. Don't touch it, but everything is provided to you, etc. So that's like one picture of the world. Then there's this rupture. Okay, so the primal sin, or whatever you want to call that, eating from the Eitz Hadat, and after that moment of rupture, there is much greater sort of independence on the part of the human, and everything shifts. Right now, all of a sudden, now they're working right for their food, as one example and one analogy to leaving the desert. And when the man stops and they enter into the land, now they're working for their food. Not to mention, now they're immortal apparently, right? So that story, that trope, that dynamic, you find in the beginning of the book, you find in Bamidbar, and maybe in a sense you find it elsewhere, also in Exodus. But maybe we'll come to that. And finally, Justin, anything? Welcome back. Anything from last week that you are sort of still mulling over or stuck with you?
I don't think so. I mean, from the introductions that we had and my prior experience with Sefer Bamidbar, I actually see it as, oddly enough, as the most mystical book of the Torah. I think that even though it's trying to convey the direction to the land of Israel, to the fulfillment of the Torah, to a switch in leadership, all along the way, the halachot and the scenarios and the scenes, like this morning, there was a reference about Moshe being the author of Sefer Bilam. So in saying that, there's this piece, like in Bamidbar, that's just hanging out there that seems odd and out of place, and you're even questioning exactly, who was where, when, what the authorship is. And in and of itself, that piece is like hugely mystical, and everything else I think sort of ties in the same kind of bent. So that's largely been my feelings about it.
Terrific, thank you. Yeah, in a sense, right, Bamidbar has more than one book because Chazal talk about Bilam's book as its own book. That's true. So you have, in a sense, 2 books in one or 3 books in one, depending on how you count it. But that's not something we're going to focus on right now. Okay, great, thank you. It's helpful for me to hear, and also I hope helpful for you, maybe just to review and hear what other people are thinking about, and jump off that. Okay, without further ado, let's continue in our exploration here. So if you open your source sheet, if you haven't yet, and I'm going to take a look at it, but I'll try not to. I'm going to try to actually not screen share right now. What's that? Does everybody have it? Okay, so let's go. So I mentioned the first verse, but which I just brought just to resituate us as a point of departure, and remember that we are in the Midbar Sinai B'Ol Moed. We're in which are two important terms. One Midbar Sinai, so we have Sinai in the backdrop. We have the book of Exodus in the backdrop. Therefore, we're still there in that general desert, and we're also in the Ohel Moed, in the tabernacle, which was constructed at the end of Sefer Shemot, book of Exodus, and then dealt with at length in what's called Torat Kohanim in Leviticus, and also picked up again here in Bamidbar. And by the way, the book of Bamidbar, the people move, right? They move geographically. They move from Midbar Sinai, and they make their way towards other parts of neighboring deserts, but eventually they end up by the Arvot Moab, right? By the I guess the plains of Moab, right? As they are poised to start entering the land. And so it's also about like that geographical journey, right? Accompanies us alongside this journey throughout the book. It's true, by the way, that the book covers kind of 40 years, but there's a long like black hole in those years, meaning in the narration, meaning we have the first 2 years are discussed, right? But then we have the sin of the spies, which we'll talk about today a bit, which was last week's parsha, and then you have this sort of like many year, 30 years, give or take, like nothingness, right? In the book silence, right? The great silence of the book. And of course, we're left to wonder, like, so what's going on during those years, right? Assumingly, for the book of Numbers, there's nothing worth mentioning unless that it's silence itself as some sort of making some sort of comment, but it's really at the end of it, right? You could pick up again as the people are poised to enter the land. So we have a geographic, transition or movement, and then we also have, a temporal movement of 40 years, right, or 38 years, or 40 years, but that 38-year gap, And here we are though in the beginning of the book, and I want to the next section from Numbers 1:48 to 50. So I want to just mention the following in terms of a theme of the book, which is, remember that the book has different names. Book of Bamidbar, the desert, that has one sort of that connotes one thing or denotes and connotes one thing. But it's also called, as we know, Numbers, right? Because of Chazal call it Sefer Pikudim, or sometimes Chazal call it Sefer Pikudim, right? The book of countings. And it's interesting. Pakad, Pei Kuf Dala, that root is worthy of its own study. That root Pakad, right? Lif Code. In this context, we're reading it as counting, right? So if you in the beginning of the book already, which is not in your source sheet, but God says at the very beginning of the book, Se'u rosh kol dapnei Yisrael mishpachotam. I want you to to lift up or count or take a census of the heads of all of the congregation of Israel according to their families and their clans and their names, right? All males, the Google according to their head count, even, right? So individuals are counted here as well. And the language there is Vayifkedem b'midbar Sinai, Kasher tzivad Moshe Vayifkedem b'midbar Sinai, that they were counted, pakad, right? They were counted in, and that's the term that you'll find repeatedly over here, pikudehem. So on the one hand, pakad can mean apparently to count. We may know from other contexts that pakad can also mean other things, right? Think about other places. What else can pakad mean? Hashem pakad et Sarah.
To take special note of. Right.
Take note of, right? Which you see how like the semantic range, right, of these terms, right, they sort of cluster around an overlapping, range of meanings, but they are distinctions here. So, right, to take special note of, to remember, right, in some sense. So God, pakad et Sarah, right, when God, when it's time for Sarah to have her own child. So God there is remembering Sarah, taking notice of Sarah, right? So it's counting, taking notice, and then there's this other meaning as well, which I want to highlight. This is not my own chidush. Rabbi Silber has said this. Others have said this in more or less, the formulation I'll share here. But so here we have verse 148 to 50, and we have that with all the shvatim, all the tribes are counted. But by the more achat mate levi lo tifkod, but they're not to count. Here's what's the translation? Do not enroll. Do not take account. Do not count the Shevet Levi with all the other tribes, and don't count them with all the other Israelites. That's verse 49. So the tribe of Levi stands apart, right, in this census. They are not counted among the census. But what does it say in verse 50? V'ata, but you, Moshe, hafked talevim ala mishkan ha'edut. You should hafked them. You should, and here they translate not count them. They translate, you shall put them in charge. You shall, I would say, appoint them. Okay, a tafkid in modern Hebrew, a tafkid is it's kind of like a job or a role, right? From the same root. And here you see that the root pei kuf dalet pakad is used in two kind of different ways within the same parshiah, in the same section here. Don't count them, but hafked them. Hafked them in the sense of appoint them. What are they appointing? They have a special role vis-a-vis the tabernacle. Hafked telabim al mishkan ha'edut v'al kol kelav, etc., etc. Right? That they shall yishartuhu v'savilu mishkan yachanu. They shall tend to it. They shall serve there. They shall serve it. They shall, be in service of the Mishkan, and they shall encamp around the Mishkan. So you see, the Leviim on the one hand have a very special role in the book of, in general, in the book of Bamidbar. Remember, they're the ones who did not partake of the golden calf, right? The sin of the golden calf. Okay, so they're sort of in that moment, set aside to have a special role, and perhaps this is relating to that in some way. But I wanted to point out, and again, others have pointed this out before me, that the word pakad here, you have two different meanings. You have the meaning of accounting in the censuses, which we talked about last week, but also the sense of tafkid, the sense of a role, right? The sense of a job to do. Okay. The way Rabbi Silber has said this is that David Silber has says this, is that the pakadness in the book of Bamidbar, Sefer Pikudim, has the sense of being counted, even individuals, according to your Google Ahem, right? According to their very skulls, right? Google Atom, excuse me. According to their skulls, each individual counts, not just the tribe, but each individual seems to count, but also a sense of accountability. Not only counting, but accountability. Because in the book, if you're counted, that means you're of significance. And if you're significant, it means that you have what to contribute. And you're bidden to contribute. You're part of this picture. You're part of this majestic entourage around the Mishkan. This is what the rabbis say. You know, why did they have people count? You know, surrounding the Mishkan, because the king's palace, which has an entourage or has guards all around it, it's a different statement than one which doesn't have it. So the people there are ennobled and counted and accountable and accounted for in their sense of their role vis-a-vis the Mishkan. And you know, I forget the name right now, but I heard someone else kind of make a pun on this, but he made an interesting argument, which is that, you know, along the lines of tafkid, of job and role, you know, the similar word, a similar conjugation of this pei kuf daled root is pikidim. Pikidim are appointees, right, or leaders. Okay, and the book of Sefer Pikudim is also, in a way, this is kind of like a pun, but Sefer Pikidim. In other words, it's a story not only of the individuals who are counted and accountable, counted and accounted for, but also that of their pikidim, of their leaders. It's a study in the sense of leadership. And what that means, what he meant by that, I believe, is that the book of Bamidbar, we talked about this at the beginning, on the one hand has a very sort of systematized and orderly arrangement of leadership. You have the Nisiim in the beginning, for example, the princes, right, who are each, you know, representing their tribes, who are sacrificing on behalf of their tribes in a way, who are leading their tribes. But you have many other leaders in the book. You have the Leviim. Right? If you remember, this week's parsha is Parshas Korach, so you remember about the story of Korach, right? Part of the tension there is about, right, the role of the Levi. With Moshe and Aaron are from the tribe of Levi, but Korach is their cousin, also from the tribe of Levi. And there's a tension there around, you know, who will actually lead and what parts of the tribe of Levi will lead, what sort of equips somebody to lead. Leadership as an obligation, but also as some sort of privilege or a right. You have the leadership of the spies who in last week's parsha, who go forth Torah to Aret to spy out or to examine the land, and other moments as well. So in a sense, another way of thinking about this book, we've talked about, you know, transition of generations. We've talked about a way of sort of levels of existence or ways of being vis-a-vis supernatural, natural. We've talked about geographic transitions, but it's also another way of thinking about this is that it's a study of leadership, right? Of various leadership models, leadership challenges, and the book is full of those. The book is full of leadership challenges to Moshe's leadership. If you remember, right, there are moments where you know, others start prophesizing in the camp, right? And there's a whole debate there between him and Joshua, basically, as to, you know, how to respond to the threat of the spread and potential threat of the prophetic, you know, capacities, you know, spreading beyond Moshe. There's the challenges to Moshe from his siblings, even from Aaron, from Miriam, the challenges from Korach, as I mentioned, and others. So part of this book is about, just to repeat, it's about the census and the counting. That's true. But it's also about people within this nation finding, counting, being accountable, therefore, and finding their tafkidim, finding their roles, right, within that orchestra of the nation, if you allow the metaphor, the orchestra of the nation, right, around the camp. And you know, in that note, maybe what I thought I would do is draw our attention to, and here I'm going to skip ahead to page 3, but draw our attention to kind of a transition moment in the book. And I want to spend page 3 onto page 4, bring us until sort of the cusp of the transition in the book, which is really from chapters 13 on. And well, even before 13, but I want to focus mostly on 13 from the story of the spies. And then we talked last week about this idea, Nachmanides really said this, or we sort of interpret him in a certain way, that the book contains many halachot, but those halachot can be understood as sort of the legally expressed ways of advancing the narrative, meaning they are halachot, which are, as he said, mostly for the desert, as opposed to for beyond the desert, as opposed to sort of eternal halachot, eternal mitzvot. And that's somewhat true, but they clearly are in conversation with the narrative. And I want to just demonstrate that by examining the story of the spies a little bit, and then some of the halachot that follow. I think you will also maybe notice something interesting with regards to those who are in morning learning in the kollel in the mornings, and learning about the cities of refuge. Okay, so let's take a look at on page 3, skipping ahead to chapter 10 here. And in chapter 10, first Moshe says to Chovav ben Ruel Hamidjani Chotem Moshe, he says to his father-in-law, maybe this is another name for his father-in-law, Yitro. He says, Nos'im anachnu el hamakom asher amar Hashem oto etin lachem. He says to his father-in-law, we are traveling, and you get the sense of anticipation. We're about to travel. We're about to enter. Because they think, and this is part of the tension of the book, or the pathos of the book, they think they're about to enter the land. They don't think that there's a 38-year, wandering about to happen. Okay, and he says to his father-in-law, "We're about to enter the land. Im anachnu, to this land. El makom asher amar Hashem oto etin lachem. Lecha itanu, go with us. Ve'itavnu lach, and let us be good to you. Ki Hashem diber tov al Yisrael, because God has promised good." To be generous to Israel, has promised good to Israel. And you'll see in this passage, if you even, as I'm talking, if you scan ahead, you'll see the root tov, right? Good, over and over and over again. Good. Everything's good. Think back to Eitzadat Tov Ra, by the way, but everything is good. We're about to enter into the land. Things, if you join us, things will be good for you. God's about to give us good. Come with us into the land. You see where Moshe's mind is what headspace he's in. And Chovav says, and this is not our top, I won't really get into so much, but I want to just to show Chovav is less short. I'm not going to go with you. I'm going to go back to my native land. He says, don't leave us, right? Because where we should camp. Here they translate GPS, where we should camp in the wilderness. This area, and you can be kind of our eyes. And that's, by the way, this comes up in the book a few times, this notion of sight. Who sees properly? Okay, who can actually see and who can't see, right? So, seeing versus blindness. He says, go with us and be our eyes. And look at the tov business here. Over and over and over again. Come with us, it'll be good for you, you'll partake of the good, etc. We actually don't know what he does, interestingly enough. Does he come? Does he not go? It's ambiguous. Maybe it's intentionally ambiguous. But you see that he's much more hesitant, right? Moshe, though, seems to believe that they're right at the cusp of entering the land, and that only Tov is they're about to encounter Tov. And if you keep reading here, something very interesting happens. By verse 33. They march from the mountain of Hashem, Vayisume Hashem derech shoshat yamim, 3 days, and the Ark of the Covenant is traveling before them, derech shoshat yamim, lator lahem minucha. See the end of verse 33 there? Lator lahem, to seek out for them minucha. So they're traveling, and 2 things you notice here. One is that they're traveling with the Ark leading the way. This has been discussed. We talked about this last week, right? This picture of them traveling, going forward, and it's the Ark which leads the way. God leads the way, and it's like the GPS. What is the divine GPS, right? They know exactly where they're going. They know exactly where they're going, and look what it does. Lator lehem minucha, to seek out for them minucha. And I mentioned last week, and if you read Parshat Shlach this past week, it should jump out at you Where else do we have this idea of, seeking out, lator lahem, right? Or tough up resh. So in the book of Bamidbar, that's a very important term, I would say, because in the Parshat Shalach, in chapter 13, verse 2, excuse me, right, later on in the book, right, after things start getting, messy, so God says to Moshe, send out men for yourself, shlach lecha anashim, right, not me, says God, but send out humans, send out anashim. Maybe anashim there means, men of renown. V'yaturu et eretz Canaan, and they shall, taf vav resh, they shall, how they translate my thing, they shall spy out, they shall examine, right? They shall seek out the land. So the spies do exactly, or sent out to do exactly which God was supposed to have done directly vis-a-vis the Aron, or as sort of symbolized by the ark of God, going to Tor, taf vav resh, not T-O-U-R, but whatever, maybe there's some relationship there, to tour out the land, to seek out, to examine, to find them a place for minucha, a place for final resting, right, in the land. And that's how it reads here. But we'll see later that everything changes. Now it's people who are being sent out to examine the land. And there, as if you examine chapter 13, again, I'm not going to read it all inside, but you'll see that they hardly describe it as an unmitigated tov experience, an unmitigatedly good experience, right? In fact, it's actually or place, I should say, right? They go to the land, and they're supposed to go to it and to see, right? What is it? Hatovahi imra'ah, is it good or bad? Says Moses, right? And as we know, they come back and they actually say it's much more complicated, and we can't actually enter the land. I'll come back to that. But you see here that in our verse that we're talking about right now, which is in chapter 10, the pictures God traveling in front of them, God is Lator Lehem. And I'm going on in verse 34, 35, God's cloud, right? Anan Hashem Alehem Yomam bin Asam bin HaMachaneh, the cloud is there. And then, does everybody see, this is very important, but do you see in beginning of verse 35 in the Hebrew, and then the end of verse 36, do you see those little sort of what they call inverted nuns? Okay, those are very important because in the text, if you look in the Sefer Torah, you'll see there's a tradition to surround verses 35 and 36 with inverted nuns. Fascinating, inverted nuns. And within those inverted nuns, it says, Vayhi, and you may recognize this from the liturgy, Vayhi bin Soa Aharon, and it was when the ark would travel, Vayomer Moshe, and God, Moshe would say, Kuma Adonai, get up, advance God, V'yafutzoi vecha, may your enemies be scattered, V'yanusu misanecha mipanecha, may your foes flee, Uvenucho Yomar, and when it halted, Shuva Adonai, Revivot Alfei Yisrael, here they translate as, return God, revote Alfei Yisrael onto the thousands of the families of Israel. Okay, but a sense that God is the one going out and coming back, and Moses has this song, if you will, right, or this chant, this battle cry that he would say, that he would start. We read this liturgically, right, when we take the Torah right out of the ark, and when the Torah is returned to the ark in synagogue. Why are there inverted nuns? So there's a tradition in the rabbis that the nuns are there as if to say this is not its place. That these verses, this is not really their place. Now, what does that mean? These are not their place. So that has many different interpretations. But one way of reading this, as has been suggested, one way of reading this notion of the inverted nuns, these verses are not in their place, is that these verses were meant to describe a what if. They're meant to describe a scenario in which all the order and vision of the first chapters of Numbers actually happen, right? And actually express themselves in entering the land. Remember, Moshe said, "We're about to enter the land." Thank you, Willow. In entering the land led by the ark of God, and this, by the way, this does sort of happen in Joshua, but nonetheless, at this point in the book, it's that they're meant to enter the land with the ark leading them, totally cared for, structured. God is at the front, leading them in, and that's a picture. It's a what if of what could have happened next, but it has the inverted nuns according to this interpretation, as if to say it never really happened. This gets deferred, because if you open your Chumash in front of you, right after these inverted nuns and the Vayomer Kuma Hashem v'yafutzoi vecha Shuva Hashem unto Israel. The very next words in chapter 11 are, and the people Vayhi'am kimit onanim. The people were like complainers. Doesn't want to say what happened exactly, but the people start complaining. And the next word is Ra be'enei Adonai, and this was Ra, not Tov, but Ra, bad in the ears of God. And you see here Ra, Ra, Ra. You see all of a sudden that the world has shifted from Tov to Ra, from Tov to, or an anticipated Tov, into a world of Ra, or unclear if Tov or Ra, as Moses says to the spies. Is the land good and bad, good or bad? And that starts this whole middle section of the book of Numbers, which introduces what we've been calling the rupture, right? Characterized very interestingly, and I encourage you to read it on your own and at greater or less depth. I encourage you to do in greater depth, but don't let that stop you from at least reading it, at some level. With a series of complaints and challenges that people encounter vis-a-vis, lack of water, lack of food, enemies, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's very, I mentioned that it's very human. It's interesting. You have a similar thing after another song, by the way, which is the song of the splitting of the sea. Because there as well, you have this picture of of sort of success and victory and the march forward, right, until the sacred place of God will be built and God is king. And then next thing that happens is the people enter into the desert, and the water is, they don't find water, and the water is bitter, and there are problems, and there are complaints, etc. Actually, the two sections from Parshat B'Shalach and our sections here are worthy of being studied in comparison. But maybe the apex of and there's so much fascinating things there to learn. But in terms of what I wrote on the sheet, I think chapter 13 we could sit on for a few minutes here and meditate upon, because this is the story of the spies, and it seems clear that the apex of the rupture occurs in the story of the spies. Okay? It's of the great ruptures, if you want to call them sins in the Chumash, you have the sin in the Garden of Eden. But for the people of Israel, you have two major sins. You have the sin of the golden calf, and you have the sin of the spies. And both are momentously significant. Right? The sin of the golden calf changes the entire covenant, and the covenantal relationship with God. The covenant's restored, but everything's different. And the story of the spies as well. Right? The story continues, but everything's different, including the entire generation. Actually, in both of them, you have this notion, you have this term, the people vayitablu or mitablim, this notion of the people mourning. Right? That term appears in both stories. People are mourning. Something has died. Something has died. The people are in mourning, and are utterly despondent. And ultimately, part of the story is ultimately, they continue partly through the intervention of their leader Moshe, but they continue on. The covenant doesn't end. But it's the great pivot and the great moment of the story. So in Parshat Shalach, if you have a Chumash or something in front of you, virtually or otherwise, hard copy, again, the spies are sent out in chapter 13. Shlach lecha nashim v'yatu et eretz Canaan. People should send them out, right? Asher aninu tel Yisrael ish echad l'matei avotav kol nasi lahem. The Nesiim are sent, and it's interesting that they're sent, one by one. It's evocative of the census. It continues this theme of people's both lay people, but also especially leaders, individual accountability, if you will, and accountability, right? The role that they play. and they go into the they go into the land. They're sent from the desert, and their names are listed, including amongst each of these people. From Mateh Ephraim, you have Hoshea ben Nun, the person who will know, right, from future stories. And it's interesting. Eila Shemot Hashem. Here are the names of the people. Asher Shalach Moshe LaTorah Ta'aret. Vayikra Moshe LaHoshea ben Nun Yehoshua. And God and Moshe renamed Hosea. He calls him Joshua. Hoshea becomes Yehoshua. I have a friend who actually wrote on Facebook. I think it was last week. He noted it's interesting that the Moshe makes sure to name this person Yehoshua. And the difference between the name Hoshea and Yehoshua is that Hoshea means God has is like, sort of is or has saved. Yehoshua is the future, right? God will save. And you see there that maybe what Moshe is doing is, anticipating that he's going to need some extra help here. And he's also anticipating that there are some people who in the story who are not going to believe in that. God took them out of Egypt, doesn't believe that God will stay with them and help them enter the land itself. And he needs to intervene and say, no, God, Yehoshua, God will save. And he sends them and he says to them, go up and go up into the land, eat them and see, what is it? And again, that's one of the themes of the book, right? Can you see properly? Remember, he says to Chovav, he says, be our eyes. Can you see properly? Can you really see? We all have trouble, seeing properly. I'll come back to this in a few minutes, but I have to mention now that the halachot that follow the story of the spies in chapters 14 and 15 include the at the end of chapter 15, the passage of the tzitzit, what we call tzitzit, right, of whatever ritual fringes, right? And the passage there plays off of our story here of the spies. There it says, God says to Bnei Israel, "Asu lahem tzitzit al kanfei bigdehem adorotam." They shall make tzitzit in the corners of their garments, and they should put on the tzitzit this blue thread. And the hayalachem tzitzit, they'll have these fringes. Uri'item oto. And you shall see oto. You shall see it. You shall see him. You shall see. The seeing seems to be part of the mitzvah. This is actually why some people wear their tzitzit out of their, if they wear a talit katan under their garments, they'll wear their fringes out, because part of the mitzvah, as they understand it, is you're supposed to be seeing the tzitzit. Uri'item oto, and remember God. And what does it say there? Remember the mitzvot. You'll do the mitzvot. V'lo taturu, and you shall not taf vav rish. Remember that term. Remember that root. You shall not repeat in some ways the sin of the spies. Don't go after your eyes in the wrong way. So it's a search, in other words, it's a search for the ability to see properly. It's a search the ability to seek out, to evaluate the next steps properly, right? And to remember the covenant, to remember the mitzvot in that context. And right, it's enacted in this sort of mitzvah way, halacha way, following the story for all of the people. And writ large, what I'm trying to argue is that if you look at chapters 13 through 15, you'll see the story of the spies. Maybe here I'll just sort of move past the story itself, and you get right into past the spies itself, and get right into chapters 15. And after for the spies and the crisis, and then it's resolved, and the people will live, but it's their children who will enter the land. We have this series of halachot about wine libations, which accompany sacrifices in the beginning of chapter 15, and halachot about what we call challah, right? The idea that some of the bread that you and the grain that you turn into bread, it has to be dedicated to God. So you have grapes and wine, you have grain and bread. Okay? These are things which you'll encounter in the land. Okay? So you see that, right, part of the function of these halachot might be to say you will enter the land, but when you get there, So that's A. Don't think you won't. You will enter the land, or your children will enter the land. But now it's time to introduce the notion of that land not being yours ultimately. The wine, the grapes from that land are to be libated, to given back to God. The grain from that land is to be turned into challah, or parts of it at least, the portion unto God. And then, it's seemingly out of nowhere, but it's really not out of nowhere if you adopt what we're saying here, which is say that halachot are part of the narrative. It says in chapter 15, verse 22, if you will err and not perform all of these commandments, if you err, which God has said to you, and if from the eyes, again, the seeing, if from the eyes of the congregation, meaning the leaders, if something was done, it was done, lishkaga was done inadvertently, right, by mistake. If the people all erred, the prime example of the example in the book of Numbers of the people erring is the story of the spies. The prime examples of the people erring in the Torah are the golden calf and the spies. And what do you do when there's shkaga? What do you do when the people have erred? Okay, how do you react to that? So there's actually a reaction, if you want to call it some sort of remedy, or I don't know how to put it exactly, right? The thing that you do when that happens. Okay, that first of all is important. There's a reaction, something that can be done when that happens. Okay? It doesn't mean the covenant's over. It doesn't mean the story's over. They're not all killed and wiped out as was a Havamina raised, try to possibly raised in the story. Okay, so we're not going to do that. But something has to happen. And what actually happens here, which I think is very important for those of you who are learning about, what you're learning in the mornings, what it says, what you do here in that case is that the kohen, basically the people are to offer, are to offer a special sacrifice. V'chiper hakohen al kol adat b'nei Yisrael. And the kohen, the priest, shall atone for all of the congregation of Israel. This is chapter 15, verse 25 of Numbers. The kohen shall offer a sacrifice. V'nislach lahem. They shall be forgiven. Kishgagahi. They shall be forgiven because it was done inadvertently. It was a mistake. Okay? And the final verse there, V'nislach l'chol adat b'nei Yisrael v'lager hagar b'tocham ki l'chol ha'am b'shgaga. They shall be forgiven, they, the stranger in their midst, because all b'shgaga. And that may sound familiar from the liturgy as well, right? Yom Kippur. V'nislach l'chol adat b'nei Yisrael v'lager hagar b'tocham ki l'chol ha'am b'shgaga. We say that in Yom Kippur for a very important reason, because Yom Kippur is our own moment of dealing with those, our own time of dealing with, as a people, as individuals, of dealing with those rupture moments. Yom Kippur is the annual cycle annual time where you come back to that, that moment, and you sort of repair the covenant, and you recite the 13 midot of God, right, the 13 attributes, and we replay not only the story of the golden calf, but in a way you're replaying the story here, where our eyes lead us astray, where we thought we couldn't enter the land, but really we can. And I mentioned what you're learning in the mornings because you see here the confluence of two things which might ring a bell for you, right? All of those who are learning in the kol in the morning: shkaga, inadvertence, an act inadvertently, and the kohen. You're learning in the mornings about inadvertent manslaughter, right? Inadvertent killing. And one of the interesting things that comes out in Bamidbar specifically, I don't think in Deuteronomy, by the way, which helps our point, right? But one thing that emerges in the book of Bamidbar is that the kohen has a specific role to play vis-a-vis the accidental manslaughter. The accidental manslaughter runs to the city of refuge, right, and they're protected there, etc. And when are they allowed to leave? When the high priest dies. When the high priest dies, then and only then are they allowed to leave. Now, what does the high priest have to do with his accidental manslaughter? And what does the death of the high priest have to do with them leaving or not leaving the city of refuge? But you can argue in the context of Sefer Bamidbar that, again, it's about leadership and responsibility of the individual and of the leaders. Priests are certainly one of those, right? Part of the leadership. And the kohen, both here in terms of the people having an accident, right, having an accidental shkaga, right, a major mistake, but a mistake nonetheless, and accidental manslaughter, Kohen is somehow implicated and has some ability to step in and help atone and help repair. Actually, I put this in your source sheets. The Gemara, the way the Gemara Moed says this on page 4, interesting passage, excuse me. Amar Rabbi Ami, at the bottom of page 4, Rabbi Ami said, why is it that in Sefer Bamidbar, Lama Nismacha Mitat Miriam Parshat Para Aduma? Why is it that in Parshat Bamidbar, in Sefer Bamidbar, excuse me, the death of Miriam, is juxtaposed with a halacha about the red heifer? The red heifer is that animal and that sacrificial rite which atones for impurity, and they're juxtaposed. And they must be juxtaposed, Rabbi Ami assumes, for some sort of reason to teach us something thematic, something meaningful. And he says this line, he says, Lomar lach, because it teaches you, ma para aduma mechaperet, just like the para aduma, the red heifer, atones for sin, right? It purifies. Af mitatan shel sadikim mechaperet. So too does the death of the righteous atone for sin. So too does the death of the righteous, of the tzaddik, atone. And Rabbi Elazar says a similar thing. Why is the death of Aaron juxtaposed to the laws of the priestly garments? Itata haron levigdei kehuna, ma bigdei kehuna mechaprin af misasan shel tzaddikim mechaperet. Just like the priestly garments atone for sin, so too the death of the righteous atones for sin. This may sound to you, by the way, you may be thinking, isn't that a Christian notion? No, it's both. What can I tell you? It's actually both. There's such notions, right, in our tradition as well. Mutatis mutandis, lahavdil, maybe there are differences, right? But the idea of the death of the righteous one, the death of the Kohen, having an effect, and here's an atoning effect on the people, you certainly hear this, right? That voice appears, right, in these sources. And I would argue that you're finding it actually rooted in what we just read here as well, right? That when the Kohen dies, it somehow can act as a moment of atonement for the accidental manslaughter. Because the Kohen is somehow implicated in that, and when the Kohen passes, he sort of removes some of that sin, right, inadvertent sin, but sin nonetheless, right, some of that residue of that death, right, of that blood from the world, and that's true as well here in Bamidbar. I did a search, by the way. You only hear of these accidents, shkagar, in Bamidbar in these contexts, unless I missed something. I think that's very telling, actually. Just to finish, but you see that the book, in the course of all of its themes, you can see the book, if you will, it utilizes these mitzvot, it places them and it puts them into conversation with the narrative. They're kind of part of the narrative. Right? They advance the story of the narrative. They're of a piece with it. And the core themes of order versus chaos, or of coherence versus rupture, individual leadership and its challenges and flaws, etc. They are all, advanced in both the narrative and also the legal sections of this book. Okay, let me pause just for a moment. Any reactions, questions, thoughts? This makes anything. Yeah, Lola.
Is the thinking that the death of a righteous person kind of atones in a way because the righteous person is responsible, like the leader is responsible for the actions of their people?
Yeah, I don't know. I was suggesting that when I said implicated. I was trying to suggest that somehow they are the eyes of the people, right? So the people don't see properly. It must be because they're not functioning properly. That's the claim that I made. It's a good question, right? It's possible to argue otherwise, that even if they were not somehow responsible, that they don't bear the guilt, nonetheless, when they're taken, somehow that, I don't know, is mechaper. It's worth thinking about.
So the Kohen Gadol is largely the main conduit of ritual. Other Kohanim, I'm of a certain age. I heard a lecture by Rabbi Soloveitchik once saying things about this. The other Kohanim were out there in the field. They were with the people. They were diagnosing Sara'at. They were doing all these other Kohen in the field. So in some ways, I would think of Kohen Gadol somehow represents potential disconnect between the hugely ritual and everyone in the field, and somehow this disconnect is represented by the actions and the upshots of individuals who wind up in our miklot, and somehow it's the passing of the Kohen Gadol that somehow offers a rectification between the hugely ritual and the hugely in the field. Put it that way.
I think that's a very interesting way of thinking about it, and it reminds me of something I suggested last week, which is that the book opens, the book of Bamidbar, with the Leviim camped around Machane Leviah, the Levitical camp, right around the tabernacle, and that's kind of where they are, right? They're the inner part of the inner circle around it. And then at the end of the book, which you guys know if you're studying in the mornings, we have these 48 cities of the Levites, and they're spread all around. They don't have their own portion, right? They're spread, and they're not sort of like, I mean, this isn't like spoken about in Bamidbar, but it's not like they're like all camped out around the temple, but they're all around the land. And the cities of refuge are actually among their cities. So you have a shift. This is kind of speaks to what you're saying, Justin. A shift in Levites being like all kind of clustered around together, right around and serving and sort of protecting the tabernacle, to being dispersed among the people, right? And indeed, the cities of refuge are among their 48 cities. And according to the rabbis, maybe that's because they're thinking along these terms, even the 42 cities which are not the cities of refuge also are collate, as they say, also somehow absorb and protect the accidental manslaughter, although in different ways than the cities of refuge proper. So just goes to support your point. That's well said. Thank you. Okay, so just to close my piece, and then again you'll advance this discussion with Rabbi Silber next week. I wanted to say something, and this is the end of your source sheet from the book of Hosea. This is a different way of speaking about the Sefer Bamidbar at large. But the book of Hosea, the beginning of Hosea, a few verses in, is chosen by the tradition as the Haftorah for the Parsha Bamidbar. And the choice of a Haftorah for a Parsha, I would like to argue, and I've argued in the past, it's not merely some sort of like linguistic connection. Oh, there's a similar word here, similar word there. I would like to believe, and I've tried to argue, that it functions on a much deeper level. And I would like to argue that the Haftorah is kind of one of our earliest forms of parshanut, of Torah interpretation. The tradition said, when you read Parsha Bamidbar, I want you to read it, and I would say maybe Sefer Bamidbar, I want you to read it in light of, through the prism of this Haftorah. This Haftorah interprets the Parsha. And I want to say something about that. If you look at the Haftorah on the sheet there, again, look at it more at length, but you'll notice, I think, two things. I underlined them to make it clear in the source sheet. One thing is, on page 5 here, right, from the Haftorah here, the people, the numbers of people of Israel shall be like that. The sands of the sea cannot be measured or counted. Okay, so one thing, by the way, is Sefer Pekudim in numbers, right? And here we have the exact opposite of a census, which is about like a delineatable, like discrete number of people. You can count them, and here you actually can't count them. There's so much. I'm talking about counting, but beyond that, I want to say is note as follows: that the desert comes up here, Bamidbar, right? The desert comes up in this Haftorah in two different ways. First, you have in verse 2 there. I'm sorry, not verse 2, in verse 5. There's this sort of rebuke on which the prophet conveys in the voice of God, right? Where God says, I'm going to, you'll have sinned and left God, and I, God, will. And it's brutal imagery. I'm sorry about that. I didn't write it, but I'm sorry to convey it. But verse 5, I will, she'll be stripped, Israel will be, and Visamtia Hamidbar, and I'll place her, I'll leave her, I'll render her like a desert, right? Thirsty and barren, et cetera, et cetera. So part of the rebuke in the Haftorah is imagining Israel as kind of a desert, kind of a midbar. And we're reading this in juxtaposition with Parsha Bamidbar, that has to sort of jump out at you. Israel will be rendered as a punishment, desolate and bare and barren and such as the desert. And that's one picture of the desert. That's one picture of the desert stories. It's a place of challenge, a place of lack, of even desolation, of rupture. And that's much of the book of Bamidbar. That's true. That is true. But when you go on to read the Haftorah would always end on a positive term. The rabbis insisted. By the way, verse 15, Ufakadati alaha, right? I shall pakad, sefer pekudim, right? I shall hold her accountable for all of the things that she did wrong. But if you skip ahead, right? Verse 16, Lachain, therefore says God eventually, assuredly, Hinei anochi mifatiha, I will speak coaxingly to her, to Israel again now. V'holachtia hamidbar, v'dibarti aliba. And I'll take her to the midbar, to the desert, and then a pun within the Bible itself, and I will speak to her. Midbar is a place of dibor, a place of communication. Place sometimes people, suggest that etymology, and it's actually referenced here. Right? That's a place of not only of destruction, desolation, but also a place of dibor, of connection, a place of reconciliation. Mifatia, a place of, it actually means a place of like sort of seduction, but a place of coming together by Miranda. A place of coming together. And I would argue that this Haftorah is chosen, or one of the effects of choosing this Haftorah, this passage of Haftorah from Bamidbar, is that it invites us to read the whole book in two different lights, in tandem, not mutually exclusive. On the one hand, the Bamidbar is indeed a place of, it's a desert, it's a wilderness, it's desolation, it's scarce, etc. Challenging. It's not a good place. Not an easy place, that's for sure. But it is also Midbar Sinai. It is also a place of dibor. It's also a place of revelation, of speech. It's a place of intimacy, right, between the people and their God as they begin their journey and become a people proper. So both of these possibilities are true. And the Haftorah invites us to read the book in light of both of those possibilities and see what happens when you read it, both in tandem. Okay, with that, we'll close for today. I invite you again, or encourage you again, to keep reading the book. Read the book of Bamidbar, and then we'll hand it over to our Silber next week for the last of this 3-part brief series. Okay?
All right. Thank you, Rabbi Kelsen. Thank you, everyone, for coming. And take care, all.
Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.